Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this first webcast of a series dedicated to the use of AscentialTest. So today's presenter is Brian Lassoir, CEO of Zinix Software. Hello, Brian.
Hello, Sandra. How are you? Thank you.
I'm fine, thanks. I'm going to change to your screen.
Great.
It's okay. We see your presentation.
Can you see my screen now?
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. Welcome, everyone. You probably all know me by my voice since I provide support for many of you. What we're going to do today is we're going to really start what I hope is going to be a series of presentations to highlight aspects of AscentialTest that maybe folks don't really know a lot about. And so today we're going to talk about building a startup and recovery system for test automation. I'm going to take you through some slides, and then I'm going to do some live demonstration to show you how you can configure something that I've written that would allow you to build a startup and recovery system for your application. And as Sandra said at the end, I'm going to leave plenty of time for Q&A. I'll also ask you at the end for suggestions for other webinars, or you can always email me, later on. So let's go ahead and get started. There's something in automated testing that I think probably you're all aware of. We call it the domino effect. And you know that when you have a set of dominoes and you push one, the rest of them fall down. Well, in automated testing, we want to avoid that effect. Because what we don't want is we don't want a test to fail sometime in the middle of the night, leave our application in a state where all of the tests that follow are unable to execute. And so that's referred to as the domino effect in automation. And what I want to do in this presentation is explain how we can avoid that effect, because when we kick off a set of automated tests, we want results. We want all of the tests to execute. So that's what our goal is here. To do that, I'm going to talk about the golden rules, what I consider the golden rules for automated test case design. I'm going to define what we call the application base state. And I think base state is a word most of you are familiar with because we have that thing called app states. So we're going to talk about those. I'm also going to go into quite a bit of detail about what actually happens when you run a test in AscentialTest. So we're going to examine the test class. This is something that we all take for granted because it just happens inside of AscentialTest. I will talk a little bit about startup, not a lot, because startup is handled mostly by the app state wizard, but I will talk a lot about this. Recovery. That's what most of this presentation is going to be about. Let's talk first about the golden rules. Now, when we design tests, to the extent that we can, every test should be independent. And I know that's not always easy, but this is something you should strive for. Every test should be independent. Another way of saying that is that no test should rely on the successful completion of another test. Now, that means something like this. We shouldn't use, for example, an account to carry out some test transaction that was established by a previous test. For obvious reasons, that's not a great idea, because if the previous test has failed and the account never gets set up, then the subsequent test is necessarily going to fail. So to the extent that you can help it, try to make all of your tests be independent. Now, in order to achieve that independence, each test should be designed to stop and start at a known state. Now, you know in AscentialTest, we refer to that as the base state. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. So what is the application base state? Well, it's the state, it's a known state from which each test starts. Typically, that's the state when the application is first invoked and logged into. So after you log into your application. In most applications, we see a main window with no other MDIs or dialog boxes open. Again, typically. I recognize every application is a little bit different. Now I want to talk about the test class. Again, I think most of you know about OnStart because OnStart is configured automatically by either the web or the Windows app states in AscentialTest. And you don't think of your main as the main, but this is really your test. So in the next slide, when I talk about the test class and we see the main, you'll see that the main is actually your test. Now there's something called onException that is built into AscentialTest that is very important. We're going to talk about that. And then Unfinish, and we're going to focus on this. These two that I have highlighted in red here, these are things that you configure. You configure the OnStart through one of the app state wizards, and then Unfinish comes to you absolutely empty, and you have to configure it. And I'm going to show you what I've done for that. Now, over on the left here is a picture of our test class. Now, I've trimmed it down a little bit. If you were to open up the test.z file and examine it yourself, you'd see that this is not the exact same class as we actually use. I pulled some things out that were not necessary for this discussion because I want you to understand the flow of the test class, and I didn't want a lot of noise in there. When you create a test in AscentialTest, know it or not, all of your tests are classes and they derive from this class. This class is built into AscentialTest. It's actually written in Z. I hope you never go in there and modify it because that's not supported and you shouldn't do that. You can look at it if you want to. Now, when a test runs, I want to talk about what the procedure is. When you run a test, so you're either in a test and you click run, or you're in a plan or a suite or a test set and you click run, what happens is this run actually gets called. And you'll see that in this test class, we have a bunch of virtual methods. We have onStart, main, onFinish. Then there's onException. Again, this is built in, you don't touch this. Run, built in, you don't touch this. The ones that we modify are really up here. And so when you go to run a test, run gets called. And you can see that right away, we go into this try catch. The first thing that gets called when a test is run is not your test. It's the onStart that is in your base state. Now, if you didn't provide anything in the onStart, say you didn't use the application wizard, the app state wizard, then this one would get called and it does absolutely nothing. It's just a virtual. But in most cases, your onStart gets called. Now, the main runs next. That is your test. And then finally, onFinish gets run. And again, by default, there's nothing in it. We have to put something in it to get it to work on our behalf. And I'm going to talk a lot about that in just a little bit. Now, if there's an error, you notice we're in a try catch. So if an error occurs anywhere here, then control passes to the catch, and we're going to go ahead and try to call onException, which is built in. Again, you don't change that. What onException is responsible for is reporting the error, and in many cases, taking a snapshot. So it's reporting an error for you. Then, if the error had not occurred inside of onFinish, the onFinish will get called. This is important because It means that Unfinish will work for you whether your test ran to completion. In fact, if your test ran to completion and it's well designed, there shouldn't be anything for Unfinish to do because it should have gone back to the base state. But if you forgot and you left the dialog box open, no problem. Unfinish will take care of that for you. And I'm going to demonstrate that for you in just a minute. But if there was an exception, well, then your test in many cases halts somewhere in the middle of the test, and all the steps that you would have actually executed in order to get the application back to its base state are never going to run because there was an exception and the test halted or failed at that point. At this point, Unfinish kicks in and does the work of getting the application back to the base state. So these bullets simply detail exactly what I just told you. Now again, the onStart, that happens at the start of each test. It checks to see whether the application is up and running. If it's already up and running, it simply returns. So in other words, if the application is at its base state, and again, in most cases, that means the main window is there with no dialog boxes or MDIs open, then it doesn't do anything at all. It simply checks to see whether or not the application is at its base state, and it returns. Now, if it's not, it starts the application, logs in if needed. And I know that this is something you're familiar with because, again, when you use the App Start wizards, this one happens to be a Windows App Start, and you can see there's the onStart there. Very simple, but most of them are very simple. It checks to see whether or not our application exists. If it does, it simply returns. If it doesn't, well, then it's going to try to start the application. And in this case, it clicks OK, because my application here, my sample, does not have a login. But if yours had a login, that would happen right here. In fact, you'll notice a change in 9.5. The App State Wizard now actually prompts you for the login dialog, so it will handle that for you as well. You'll actually see a couple of new 9.5 features as I go through and start to demonstrate AscentialTest. There's going to be some things that you see that you're not familiar with, and that's because they're brand new, and we hope to have that out by the end of the month. Now, I do want to concentrate on Unfinish. At the end of every test, AscentialTest will check through the Unfinish whether or not the application is in its base state. So again, very similar to what the onStart did. Is the application in the base state? If it is, then it simply returns. There's nothing to do. So this again would be the case where a test case ran. It ran to completion, there were no errors, and your test case was well designed, so it closed everything up and you're back at your base state. If it's not, then you need to close anything that's open. And I say dialogues, but that could be anything. It could be MDI children, anything that is left open. This is the work of Unfinish. Now, what I've done is I built an Unfinish, and it's available to you. But what I want you to know about it is that this was built by trial and error, and your configuration of it, if you decide to use it, and I recommend you do if you don't have something like this already, will also be trial and error. I'm going to take you through what this does. It's actually not very difficult at all when I actually explain it to you. You'll see. We're going to ignore that. Sorry about that. And you'll see that it isn't really complicated at all. I've created something called Close Active Window. And this function takes two parameters: the name of your main window, the app name, the app object name, and the number of attempts that you want to go through in order to close the application, get the application back into its base state. So what it does is it goes through a big loop. And the loop starts with a while, and it says while true, and I attempts, which is set to 1, is less than or equal to the max attempts, which gets passed in. So this is how many times it's going to go through the loop. You'll see that the whole thing is based on a one big try catch. So here's the try over here, and here's the catch. So let's talk about the try. What we're going to do is we're using something that you may not be familiar with, and this is a very, very interesting and important feature of AscentialTest. There's something called UA.getActive. If this didn't exist, my close active window wouldn't work. In fact, it would be very difficult to do. So this is a very, very important method inside of AscentialTest. So UA.getActive is going to return a window. What is the active window? If it's not equal to the main window, which you passed in, then we're going to go ahead and come in. If we don't, if it is, you'll see it goes to the else, and I just simply print the main window is active. There's nothing to do, really. It's just going to break, and this function is going to return. But if the main window is not the active window, then let's go on and see what happens. First thing I do is I print to see what is the active window. So again, this is information. This is all going to come back to you in the results file. Now, sometimes the active window might not even be part of the hooked application. It might be some window that popped up. And so how did I know that? I didn't. Again, built by trial and error. As I started to test this, I realized, oh, sometimes this application, this dialog is just going to pop up, and I need to see if I can handle it. So I put out a message that says that a unhooked application window was active. I'm going to assign that to AO, and then I'm going to try to close it. Now, excuse me, AO was assigned up here when I did the get active. If AO is null, then it got overridden by whatever that unhooked window was. But in most cases, it's going to be some window in the application. Now, I'm going to try to close it. So I'm going to call the built-in close method. I don't know if you know that, but there's a close method built in AscentialTest for every dialog box, every window. I'm going to try to close it. But I'm going to try catch. So if there's an error, I'm going to look and see what possible errors I might get. In this case, you might get the error that says the type, and you'll see this actually in my demo when I demo it for you. Your object doesn't contain a method called close. So it didn't inherit one for some reason, because of the type of window that it was. And so I put a message out that says, please add a close method to your window. And I'm going to show you how to do that a little later in the demonstration. Then we're going to take a snapshot, because you want a lot of information from your Unfinish. Because remember, you've got to try to imagine what was the state of the application when this occurred. Then what we're going to do is we're going to try to close that thing. Even though it doesn't have a close method, we're going to use some sort of universal ways of closing applications. I'm going to try to click on the close button. If I can't, it'll go into the catch. I'm going to try hitting escape. You might know that in Windows, escape is sort of a general way of closing something that's been left open. If that doesn't work, I'm going to print the message, and then I'm going to try it again and see what happens. Now, if any errors occurred inside of here that were not handled, we're going to go over to the catch. And one thing that might happen is you might find that you're comparing dialog box and something else, and it's not supported, this comparison. So again, how did I know this? Trial and error. I actually got this message, so I decided I would catch for it. And then I put out a message that explains that. It says the dialog box, and it says see the snapshot below, because I'm going to take one, has not been defined. This is the case where a window in your application was up, but you don't have an app object for it. And that's what this message means right here. And so the message tells you, define it to streamline your recovery system. So an app, a dialog box or something popped up, you had never created a snapshot and an app object for it. And that's why this error occurred. And then again, we're going to make an attempt to close. So you're going to see the same thing. We're going to try to click the close box. We're going to try to hit the escape key. We try this a number of times. And then we get to the bottom, and as if we've gone through this whole thing, more than the number of max attempts, then finally we're going to give up, put out a warning that says, close active windows may not have closed all the open dialogues. So again, this is meant to give you a lot of information so that you can continue to work on this close active window. This is only a beginning or a template, something that you could take and modify. Now I'm actually going to demonstrate it for you now. We're going to put our application in some states, and we're going to learn about how this will actually work. So let me bring over AscentialTest. And I actually have my target application up already for this first part of the demonstration. And what I want to do is I'm going to run a very small test for you that's actually going to, it would leave the window up. But because my Unfinish is enabled, it's going to close it. But I'm going to run it for you a couple times so you can see what happens. So let's run it the first time. It's going to bring up this dialog box. Now, my test doesn't close that dialog box. I forgot to do that. So what happened is the recovery or the Unfinish kicked in, and it actually took care of that. And I'm going to show that to you now. So I'm going to come in here, and I'm going to go to my Unfinish, and I'm actually going to comment out this close active window. Notice that in my Unfinish to my app state, that's the only thing in there is my close active window, and I'll show you where that lives and so forth later and how to install it in your application. So now let's save this. Save my whole project just to be safe. I go here again, and I'm going to run it again. Now, I popped open the dialog box, but watch what happened. The dialog box was left open because in my test, I never closed it. Now, that's going to be a problem because watch what happens now. If I try to run it again, nothing's going to happen. I'm going to get an error because the object that I need to click in order to invoke this dialog box is disabled. This is the problem that I was describing right from the start. This is the domino effect. If I leave open this dialog box, it pretty much disables anything else that I might want to do in my application. So any test that I run subsequent to this dialog box being left open is going to fail. I'm going to come in the morning and, maybe I ran 500 test cases, but, this was number 20. And so the rest of my automation just isn't going to run. Everything's going to be in an error state. I've wasted the entire evening's run. So I'm going to go ahead and put that back in now. But you can see what happens if you try to run and you don't have something built in order to get yourself back into the base state. So let me come back here again. And oh, actually, no, I'm going to leave it. I'm going to leave it for the first one. So I'm going to close the application. And I just want to check my notes here to make sure that I do everything in the correct order. So now I'm going to run another test for you. And I want you to notice what's left open by default. So we're going to come here and I'm going to run another test for you. Now the app pops up. It's a very short test. Well, it was supposed to be a little longer than that. Something might have gone wrong because I've got my presentation window open. I thought I'll have to close that. Okay, let's see what's going on here. I'm gonna close my my presentation here. Okay, it's gonna fail. Let's try that again. Just want to make sure that I didn't leave, when I was testing this before, that I didn't leave anything in a bad state. Let's try again. So we're going to close the application. Whoops. There we go. So here's my test running. Again, it's a brief test. But what I want you to notice is that at the conclusion of my test, I'm not at my base state. You see this purchase order was left open. This about was left open. What should have happened if my recovery system was on is this should have been closed, this should have been closed. This is my base state. This was the application when I logged in and I first brought it up. So we're going to try that again. But this time what we're going to do, I'm going to go back into my app state and I'm going to uncomment my call to close active window. And when I run it again, you're going to notice something different. So here's my test running again. Putting in a purchase order, then I query the purchase order. Now here's where my app state's going to kick in, and my Unfinish is going to close that window and then close the about window. Now I am back to my base state. And I want to show you the trace here. Here's another new feature that I think is going to make a lot of you guys happy. You'll notice now that in the results file, all the steps have been, you can see each step in the results file, and you can actually collapse and expand. So because people have told us that when they look at the results file, they can't tell which action is inside of which step. So now you can very clearly do that. And again, you can expand and collapse these things. So that's another 9.5 feature that will be out, we expect around the end of the month. But what I want to draw your attention to here is these messages down below. These are the messages that are coming back from that close all windows. And if you look at it, you can see what's going on. You can see that it said, okay, we're going to provide a second for something to become active. Then we're going to go ahead and hit close. We're going to provide another second for the next window to be active. We're going to hit close again. And so at the end of this, because I had everything working correctly, the main window is active. It finally got to that else, and it says that the main window is active. Now, let's do it again, but we're going to modify a few things. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go into one of my objects. I'm going to go into this object about, and I'm going to comment out the close so you can see what happens if you don't have a close method. So I'm going to bring down my app again. And so here in AscentialTest, I'm going to go to my app objects. And here's this window about PB Ultimate Suites. I'm going to take this close method here that I provided, and here's my close method. It knows to go to the tool strip and click close. I'm going to take that and I'm going to comment it out. So what that means is that now I have a window that has been defined. It's the About PB Ultimate Suites, but it doesn't have a close method. Well, let's see what happens. So I'm going to come here again, and I'm going to run the same test. Now, purchase order is going to be closed because it has a close method, but not this one. Because I didn't provide a close method, the recovery system doesn't know how to close it. It's not a dialog box, so there's no close box, there's no escape. You know, this is an MDI child, so there's no way to close this thing universally. So that's why I needed a close method. Now, if we look at the trace, we're going to see something a little bit different this time. It's going to tell us that the window About PB Ultimate Suite does not contain a close method. So the way that this is built, it does help you figure out how to configure it better in order for your recovery to get better and better. And you know, there's a warning there that says, you know, we might not have closed all the windows. So the Unfinish is intelligent enough to know that the application might not be back at its base state. And it's, again, giving you information. Of course, I haven't been clicking on these, but you'll notice I've been taking snapshots again so that you can see what the application looks like. Now, we're going to do one more thing. I'm going to go back in, and I'm going to put the close in. So I'm going to uncomment that. So my close method is now back in. I'll go ahead and save it. But I'm going to do something else bad. I'm going to come in here to this window, and I'm going to give it a path that's kind of ambiguous. So this particular path isn't specific enough to identify the About Ultimate Suite. And I believe what's going to happen here is that it's not going to close it again. And the reason why I'm even telling you this is because, and many of you who have done support with me know, I always harp on this, all of your top level windows must have a unique path. They shouldn't match more than one window in your application. So let's see what happens when I do that. So I'm gonna close my application again. I'm gonna come here and run it one more time. Now, purchase order is going to get closed, right? But About isn't again. And the reason is because we can't distinguish it. We don't know that application from other windows. So again, the point is you need to be really cognizant of the fact that every single one of your top level windows, and what I mean by top level windows is all the ones that are defined here at the root, those all have to have a unique path. So just so that I don't forget, I'm going to go ahead and put my good path back in again. Now, a couple of other things that I want to show you as we've got AscentialTest up before I go back to the slides. I want to show you where this method is, and I want to explain how I put it into the app state. So let's take a look. Now, you know that in AscentialTest, if you create a function, it will show up here in the functions. And I did. I created this function, the one that I showed you called Close Active Windows. I created this function, again, by trial and error, but there's the actual function. We were looking at a slide before. It is the exact same function as we were looking at. And it is here in close active windows. Now, how does it get here? Well, I built it into this specific project, but what I've done is I put close active windows in its own file. I believe I've called it utilities.z, and I'm going to make sure that that file is in the installer for 9.5 so that you have this, so that you don't have to ask me for it. And then what you'll be able to do is you'll be able to come over to your project library and simply say add existing Z file, and then you will point to, you'll put that file, that utilities.z file that I'm going to give you, you'll put it into your project. You'll come over here to your project folders, your libraries, your project library, and you'll actually put the file physically right here in your project. That's the first thing you're going to do. So again, you're going to go to Project, open Project folder, navigate to Libraries, Project Library. You'll put the file here, and then you'll use Add Existing to navigate, and you will find that file. You'll put the file into your project. Once you do that, then the close active windows will show up here inside of functions, and I grouped it into a group called utilities. Once you have that, you can then go to your app state, and I have my app state here. My app state is right here. I built this just using the wizard, just like you do. And again, normally what most of us are accustomed to is when we have an app state, by default, the onStart is open, and this is what the wizard builds for you. You don't have to do this, of course, the wizard does it for you. But if you want to see the Unfinish, you come here and you click, and the Unfinish is here. Now, what did I do with my Unfinish? I simply took this and I just dragged it over and dropped it. That's all I did. And then I gave it the app object name, PBU sample of my main window. I'll show you that in a minute. And I decided I was going to do 5 attempts. Here's the PBU sample. So that's the name of my main window. So that's what I put in here. This is the window that we want to be the active window. And we're going to try 5 times. We're going to go through that loop I showed you 5 times before we give up. I'm going to keep that open in case at the end you guys have some questions. So let me go back to the slides now. I just want to summarize, and then I'm going to turn it over to you for questions. So we're going to have plenty of time for questions. We talked a little bit about the golden rules and how each test case needs to be independent. Test cases should not rely on the successful completion of a previous test case. We talked about the application base state, and typically that state being the main window open with no other dialog boxes, MDI children open, and that's typically the state of the application after you bring it up and log in. Then we talked about the components of that class, that test class that all of our tests are based on. And we traced through that class so that we understood what happened when the run method was actually run. It ran the onStart or the startup. It then ran the main. And then if necessary, it recovered the application if the test didn't run to completion and get the application back to its base state.